Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV WORLD. In today's show, we will be talking about the Quad Alliance and the evolving situation with regards to the crisis in Ukraine. We know that the meeting between the Quad countries is scheduled to take place today, and there's a lot going on in terms of what exactly is this alliance going to entail. We've seen statements coming in from Antony Blinken saying that the Indo-Pacific region is of utmost importance and that they need to secure it from any sort of coercion by any other nation or countries, and that's extremely important for them, with no specific reference to China, but perhaps that is what the engagement is directed towards. The Quad alliance between Australia, Japan, India and the US has deepened in the last couple of years, and we've seen that these meetings are aimed at containing China's influence in the region and then in the world as well. With reference to the Ukrainian crisis, could possibly be another agenda of discussion and to see the way forward. Also, when we see the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping come out with no real stance from the Chinese side against the Ukrainian crisis, and the engagement deepening between the two countries could cause further suspicion and doubt among the Quad alliance and increase their engagement as to ensure that the China policy with regards to its containment in the region is continued. We also know that there are statements coming in from the US side saying that Russia could invade Ukraine at any possible time, something that they say can also possibly happen before the Winter Olympics end, which is around the 20th of February, which of course is a very short span of time and points towards the fact that the situation is escalated enough for any sort of military action or invasion to take place at any given time. They've also directed US citizens to leave Ukraine, and Joe Biden has also said that it will not send troops to rescue Americans there if they do not leave after before the Russian invasion. At the same time, we've seen that Russia has denied any plans of invading Ukraine, even though a large amount of troops have been amassed around the border. What is going on with reference to the Ukrainian crisis? What exactly is in the works according to the US? And then, of course, what is the Quad alliance going to really achieve in terms of what it wants to do with reference to its partner, and then the way that it wants to take forward against Russia and China. We'll explore all of these issues in further detail in the show. And as always, I've been joined by Farrukh, Pitafi and Faisal in the studios. Thank you for joining me in the studios. And we've also been joined by our experts online. We've been joined by Leonard Savin, who's the Director General of the Foundation of Monitoring and Forecasting Russia. And we've also been joined by Tom O'Connor, who's a Syrian foreign policy writer at Newsweek, Staten Island, New York. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us on the show today. With reference to what is going on in the world and the way that we've seen, particularly these four countries come together, their agenda seems to be targeted towards China, but of course no real reference has been made towards that. We've also seen that with reference to how the situation is escalating in Ukraine, this could be another area where we can see the Quad alliance deepen and their work also strengthen. When we see the recent meetings take place and the kind of statements that have come out, what can be the overall agenda in terms of tangible actions taken by all of these countries with regards to what they say is protecting or ensuring that the nations and countries in the Indo-Pacific region in particular are protected by any sort of coercion? Mr. Tom, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Could you please answer that for me?
Sure, absolutely. So I think, as you noted, there is no clear reference to China in these statements that come out, yet obviously by the policies and the positions that they're taking, it's very clear that this is aimed in somewhat towards containing China. Now, it's important to note that this is not an Asia-Pacific NATO. They are not an alliance. The U.S. is already in alliance with Australia and Japan separately, but not India. And India's role here is key because India is officially a non-aligned power, although it's drifted quite close to the West recently. It's not, and there's no indications that it's looking to formalize that position. And part of this is also because, and it's related to the Ukraine stuff as well in some ways, because India is very close to Russia. And with China and Russia's strategic alignment in recent years, also not a formal alliance, India, I don't believe, will want to take any sort of formal alliance position in this regard. Now, I think it's still very important to see these four powers coming together because you are seeing the U.S.'s game to sort of shift the geopolitical cards in its favor against China in its own arena. And that's what we've seen right now. We've seen, of course, a strong Chinese reaction to that as well, with some drills in response in the region.
We've also seen responses coming in from the Chinese side, also putting up attacks against U.S. democracy, questioning its own democratic values, and how these countries could be champions of the way forward, as they're talking about, and protecting these nations from coercion. Leonid, when we see all of these measures and these aspects being talked about, what really is the defining goal or aim of the Quad Alliance in terms of what it wants to achieve in the region, irrespective of a very direct threat or what they want to work against? When we see the alliance coming together, what are their larger goals? Because at the moment it seems quite broad or ambiguous in terms of the kind of norms it wants to establish, what it really wants to do with reference to the other countries. Is it just a collaboration in different areas, or they're also looking forward in an ideological sense to pursue their goals in Indo-Pacific region?
We see that during this meeting of Quad, there is Ukraine on the table. So it's not only Pacific or Indo-Pacific or Asian Pacific. It's all about global issue and the global influence and control. And of course, it's this bloc led by United States. So India, Australia, and Japan just kind of satellites of Washington and the following of agenda developed by White House and State Department. It's clear. And more than 10 years ago, there was project of Pacific pivot of Barack Obama, and it was not succeed. And now United States would like to bring military aspects to form a new bloc in this region. Of course, because Pacific is very important from world economic point of view. But it's not only about China containment. It's about North Korea, for example, and about attempt to build a multipolar new world order by China, by Russia, by Iran, and by other countries, but also by Pakistan. So it's just attempt to keep old policy of unipolarity from United States. It's the main reason of this Quad.
Yeah, Tom.
All right.
Yeah, if you allow, Tom. If we look at the Quad, of course, you have mentioned that it's an alliance where India hasn't got a sort of stuck to it, and India is doing whatever it had to do in obviously against China. So I just wanted to know, as you've mentioned that it is for Indo-Pacific, it's a sort of Indo-Pacific alliance. Could we say that Quad would help out India in terms of if India is having a clear conflict and there is a war against China, and could we see Americans, come in there and helping them out? Because if we talk about the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region, of course, India is part of it.
Yeah, I think that we're not there yet in terms of the Quad structure and its positions right now, its formal structure. It's not necessarily an alliance as it stands. There isn't the sort of Article 5 you see in NATO, and I believe it's Article 4 in the CSTO, Russia's own alliance, which would essentially mandate a collective defense. If one country's attacked, they all must respond. That's not to say, of course, that if there was an open conflict between India and China, that Quad countries would not get involved, of course, but it would not be through the structure of the Quad as it stands right now. I think the Quad right now is more of a geopolitical position, and certainly it's moving in the direction of more military cooperation and cohesion. We're seeing that, so it's something to certainly keep an eye on. But I think that India's non-aligned position keeps that from being a formal alliance, and probably many more things too. It's not just that, but that's a very important aspect of this. We have to understand that these are four countries with different national interests, and although they see eye to eye on many things, the unique character of their interests and their position does, I think, so far forego that formal alliance, whereas if one country's attacked, they all will certainly respond.
Right. This brings me to something, Farrukh, we discussed in a previous program as well, where you pointed out how a lot of the terms that we're using today, such as engagement or containment, are a thing of the past and perhaps are not very applicable to the way things are going right now.
Right.
But is that really so with the way that we see the alliance, when specifically the goals it is trying to achieve? Is it not just merely a sphere of influence that they want to create?
Right, and that is very interesting thing, Sana. Remember, you have to bear in mind two things. One, I don't take any pleasure in berating the discipline of international relations as a fake science
Right.
or pseudoscience. But with due respect, when only one theory has been proven, and that is balance of power, all of the rest have been disproven. And then when you talk about their prediction, their record, it has never been successful in predicting anything. You have to realize that how out of depth all the pundits have been, right? One aspect that you have to look at, and that is very important, is this term which is Indo-Pacific. It is not a real
Right,
term.
right.
They are two separate oceans. In the middle, you have entire countries, their territorial waters. So this Quad alliance, if you want to call it alliance, I would more or less call it a state of mind and then a babysitting club, because when you talk about two countries which are very crucial partners of the US, one is Australia, the other is Japan. Both have bilateral agreements with the US, and then, thanks to AUKUS, a trilateral agreement as well. The only country that needed or felt left out and has been, the pundits actually have been talking up Quad alliance, so to speak, is India. And why do they do it? Because they keep on having this feeling that somehow they are going to be taken over by China, or perhaps if they sell China as the enemy to the West, they are going to benefit from it. Honestly, when you look at the state of affairs, every day things are changing, and this is a new century, a new millennium, and in this new millennium, things cannot be predicted the way they could be in the previous century, right? And even then, IR never got it right. How do you think they are going to actually predict today? So right now, it is basically babysitting India. And look at the mandate. Look at the overall program of Quad. They have been focusing basically on vaccines. They have been focusing more or less on trade issues. So it is not technically any kind of an alliance. Yes, bilaterally every country will perhaps have some kind of connection. And remember, Biden administration is significant in one aspect. It is the first post-Trump presidency. Trump actually disengaged from the world, and now they are trying to build confidence. And because of that, they had this difficulty that if they woo one ally, the other, all of others actually start actually having second thoughts, like in AUKUS, France, right? So at this moment, what they are doing is creating as many avenues as possible and then move on and create more. You cannot say that it is going to be the shape of things to come.
If I could ask Leonid about, if we look at Russians, of course, Russia has concerns related to AUKUS, related to Quad, and of course, Russia might, think about, reaching out to Indo-Pacific in coming future. So I just wanted to ask, the very recent, meetup between President Putin and President Xi. Of course, there would be many angles to it that were discussed. I just wanted to ask, in coming future, could we see Russia aligning itself with China related to Indo-Pacific, and of course, connecting itself with CPAC to get into the Indian Ocean through Central Asian Republics?
First of all, I need to mention that our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, told that Quad undermined security system in the Asian Pacific region. It's very important for Russia because Russia more looking to the east, and we have a special partnership agreement with ASEAN countries, and of course China is our very good partner. And in this month, we expecting visit of Prime Minister of Pakistan Imran Khan to Moscow. So we'll discuss more about deals with, in the sense of bilateral ties, Russia and Pakistan, of course. And the spec will be discussed during this agenda, of course. And Russia already started some cooperation projects with Pakistan. I mean, project of pipeline. There's some Russian companies already involved. And I hope that will be some frame for security project with Pakistan and Asian region itself, because Afghanistan topic is also very important for Russia. We know this situation, and we agree with China and Pakistan on this issue. And of course, any Western attempt to influence and to dismantle our attempts to bring more security to the region, very dangerous from Russian point of view. It's also the reason that Russia sent proposals to United States and to NATO to discuss this agreement, new agreement on European security, not also European, it's global security question.
Right. Tom, when we talk about how the Quad Alliance is giving statements of it wants a free, open and a fair society and has this shared vision of going forward with that, and then of course collaborate in terms of disaster management or climate change or even to counter terrorism. These are all of course big claims, and of course when you say something that the countries themselves have their own varied national interests, can we really expect any sort of shared policy or shared vision coming out of the Quad Alliance? And with specific reference to the way that they want to be able to tackle terrorism, do you think that they really have any sort of measures or strategies already in place in terms of how this will practically manifest itself in a collaboration?
I think it's early to say. I think it's certainly trending in the direction of more cohesion among the countries. That's not to say there aren't substantial differences between them still that may never be overcome. So when it comes to specific goals like that, yes, it's very difficult. Climate change, and you mentioned counterterrorism specifically. And part of this, and also vaccine diplomacy was mentioned earlier. Part of this kind of makes me think that it's sort of an attempt to catch up to the more soft power partnerships that are being built around the world. And we look at China and also Russia, for example. I think of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think of various institutions being put in place that have regular joint counterterrorism exercises, which seem much more cohesive and have much more interoperational abilities among the countries there. We haven't yet seen that really with Quad. We've seen limited instances, of course, maritime drills, other joint operations and exercises and maneuvers, but I'm not sure we're quite there yet. And I think it's going to be quite difficult for the U.S. to be able to enact that sort of thing, because if it's limited to these 4 countries, there's still a substantial amount of difference in their policies and what they really want to let on to the world as far as their commitments to these sort of goals.
Right. Another aspect which shown out to me, Farrukh, when we were of course exploring the story, is that something that came up again and again is that how they will stand against anyone who seeks to use coercion in terms of any of the nations and against each other, the alliance itself as well. Isn't this something which is also hard to explore and understand what really would entail coercion? There's so many different ways that coercive strategies are now being employed, that what sort of a definition are they looking at? Is it limited to military action, or will it be applicable to every and any mean to explore that?
Right, and enforcement has been the biggest problem or Achilles heels of international law. Whenever you talk about any kind of decision, of course the laws are there, but who's going to implement them, right? We keep on hearing China, Russia, America, all other countries keep talking about a rule-based world order, right? But when it comes to enforcement mechanism, thanks to the UNSC and every other mechanism that we have seen, we haven't seen actual teeth to bite. And that is a problem. Now look at the Quad, so-called alliance, and which country would be willing, if for example, if tomorrow China is going to, actually disregard some international rule, who is going to implement it?
Right.
Do you think that it is India that is sitting next to it is going to launch a war or a punitive mechanism, or Japan for that matter, or Australia for that matter, or the US will come from all over the world, right? So these things are not realistic, with due respect. The problem at this moment is we keep on assuming because we see behavior patterns. For example, we have seen Beijing actually closing down and actually shrinking back into within its body. Then we also see Russia actually confrontational occasionally. But all of this can change whenever there is some breakthrough between three leaders in the world, right? So you cannot make assumptions. For example, there's a beautiful book called The Pivot by Kurt Campbell, right? He is now Biden administration's, he is part of NSC in this administration, a senior director of the institution. And that book is fascinating. But when you read it today, you realize that how much the world has changed now. You know, China is the dynamic between China and Russia, America hasn't gone away. They still are trading. They still are functioning together. China owns a lot of America's foreign debt, right? Similarly, when there was some kind of boycott or there was a lack of cooperation or ban on Huawei, we saw Huawei was actually struggling. So this is a very different world where only one microbe managed to shut down the entire world. So why are we thinking that there is going to be another Cold War and these elements versus those elements are going to actually play any part? I think we finally will find a way to work together.
Yeah, Leonid, I have another question for you. You know, looking at the very recent meetup between both of the presidents from Russia and from China, could we say that Russia that had a very good relation with India, and so far it is bilateral relations I'm talking about, and you know, owing to the fact that Indo-Pacific is a point of concern, and if we talk about China, China has concerns in the East China Sea as well, and Japan and India being part of Quad, could we see the cold kind of chapter coming into bilateral relations with Japan and with India of Russia?
First of all, of course, Russia would like to have normal relation with all actors in Eurasia and abroad, and we have less or more normal relation with India. Sometimes we have some problem issues for bilateral trade, for example, and etc. But it depends, I think, for the moment, mostly of New Delhi, how to build next relation with Russia, for example, because for last few days, some Indian media were very active to provide anti-Russian disinformation propaganda on Ukrainian issue and pro-Western issue, etc. So relations with China will be grow more and more. It's we see from economics point of view, political point of view, and last joint declaration of Putin and Xi Jinping during the opening of Olympic Games in Beijing. It's more depend of Russia-Chinese relation, of course, and about partnership who deal with Russia and China. So India will be on second place.
Right. Tom, with reference to, of course, what we're talking about, the Quad Alliance tendency or inclination to work against China, there's also North Korea. Do you think that with reference to how we are seeing the situation develop and the alliance strengthen, possibly we can see further alliance being developed and strengthened with the issue of North Korea?
Well, we certainly see North Korea issue certain statements also condemning the Quad and its position, especially because of Japan's role and the U.S.'s role. Of course, it's a very sensitive issue for North Korea. Any sort of indications of a besiegement or alliance or strategically around North Korea will certainly be met negatively by Kim Jong-un. I'm sure of that. At the same time, I don't see that right now as a major priority of the Quad. I think definitely it's in the calculus. I think certainly they know that beyond China, there's also North Korea there, which also, because of course, of its nuclear weapons and its missile capabilities, of course, just recently have been displayed in almost unprecedented rate. certainly it's a concern, but I do believe that right now that China is perhaps the main focus, and I don't discount the fact that there might be broader geopolitical goals beyond China. And I think that in one side of it, of course, is wanting to contain China. The other side of it is to want to expand the U.S.'s own influence. The term was earlier unipolarity. I think that the U.S. is very concerned about the emergence of a multipolar world where countries like Russia and China, and specifically Russia and China, who see eye to eye more than the U.S. does with either of those countries, could in some ways outweigh or at least balance to parity U.S. influence in that region. And we've seen China and Russia conduct joint patrols. We've seen them issue more statements that align with one another's positions in Taiwan and to some degree Ukraine as well, but in Taiwan certainly. So I think that definitely the Quad wants to ensure that its own position, and specifically the U.S.-led position, I could say, is reinforced. And I think that, of course, North Korea is a part of that as well to some degree.
Right. Let's come to the Ukrainian crisis with specific reference to when we see about the Russian engagement and China's involvement as well with the Russian side increase, and that, of course, as Tom was talking about, is a source of suspicion for the U.S. side as well. Leonard, when we see the Ukrainian crisis unfold, of course, there are statements coming in from Russia that it has no plans to invade Ukraine, even though there is a lot of troop buildup in the area. We see that when Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping met, there has been no statement coming in from the Chinese side with regards to how Russia needs to back off from the Ukrainian border, something which, of course, is disappointing and troubling to the U.S. as well. How far do you think the engagement between Russia and China can we see develop with reference to the Ukrainian crisis?
China and Russia have a little bit different position about Ukraine, about Crimea, as well as Russians see about, at least till last moment, about Taiwan. But a week ago, Russia officially recognized the idea about one China together with Taiwan. So I think there is kind of silent agreement between Moscow and Beijing about Taiwan issue and about Ukrainian issue. And of course, China interested also in Ukraine technologies and in the Ukrainian market itself, and there was serious debates about Chinese investment, and now it's stopped because Motor Siege factory blocked by Western partners of the Ukraine, namely United States, mostly blocked this agreement of Ukraine and China. So China is interested about good relation between Ukraine and Russia too. But Kiev not following Minsk agreement. It's the main problem. Minsk agreement was also implemented by Security Council in the United Nations. So it's internationally recognized. And now Kiev wants to freeze this deal and to provoke aggression in Donbass region and doing something that not in accordance with Minsk agreement. So it's the corner of the problem now.
Right. Tom, since we are talking about Ukraine now, and we keep on seeing these readouts coming from the State Department about how soon Russia might invade Ukraine. And then we saw that interesting exchange during the briefing by the State Department spokesman as well, where it seemed that Alex Jones was brought up. The question right now is, how sure are the US authorities that there is going to be some kind of invasion? One. Secondly, when you look at the state of affairs, it seems that it is not a tenable position. Either the forces will have to move forward or backwards. Which one is more reliable at this moment? Because somehow one feels that although the US has convinced itself that there is going to be an invasion, other countries are not that sure.
Even Ukraine itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point, because I was just going to point out that, we had extensive conversations with top Ukrainian former officials within Zelensky's circle. And there was a suspicion that the U.S. might be hyping up this intelligence in order to pressure Russia, to pressure Moscow to sort of back it into a corner and essentially force it to either act or don't act. It's in some ways there was some hesitation about that position because it could be seen as a provocation, of course. But I think that in the U.S. the concern is that Kiev is downplaying it because for economic reasons, of course, for social stability reasons. I think that both sides obviously have their narrative as to why there's such a divergence in opinion here. And when it comes specifically to what Russia will do next, I mean, I think that's really, President Putin, I think, keeps a very tight circle within the Kremlin. And I think that it's really, he'll have the final say on whatever happens. Now, I will point out that we have heard from the U.S. side that there are potential indications that, or I should say at least concerns within the intelligence community that the idea of a false flag being staged as from Russia against ethnic Russians in Ukraine may have actually been a plant from Russian intelligence. And we're getting into this category of spy games, which I know we're in a new era right now, but does kind of remind us of these sort of Cold War era deceptions and deceptions within deceptions. Yeah. So it's very difficult to say. And the fact that the U.S. has not provided open evidence to the media has certainly caused some concerns here. They've declassified only the idea that this could happen and given some scenarios, but they've not provided, of course, substantive backing for that. That's not a commentary on whether the evidence is true or not. It's just the strategy that the U.S. has pursued, the Biden administration specifically. And of course, it opens up to a lot of criticism. As for Russia's calculus, though, one last time, I think that it's certainly been made clear, I think, from the Russian side that attacking Ukraine and going to war with Ukraine, I just spoke with the Russian ambassador a few days ago, and he assured my readers that there would be not an attack on Ukraine. That's not the goal here. The broader goal from Russia is to gain a sort of re-understanding of the Eastern European security order and, of course, reaching new assurances with NATO and sort of re-entering that dialogue, but of course setting new parameters that favors a more powerful Russia than was the case 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Tom, another question from you. As you've just mentioned that there are obviously, if we talk about the Donetsk and the region, ethnically, they are Russians. 85 to 90% of their population is Russians. And could we say that U.S. in coming days come to terms with it that if Russia can, invade Ukraine and stays till Donetsk, that's fine. We won't do anything. But as soon as it starts heading towards Kiev, of course, that's where the problem would start. Could we say that?
I think it's certainly, the U.S. has been very careful to say that would not be the case, that they will consider any sort of intervention from Russia into Ukrainian territory as essentially an invasion, and that could trigger those as heavy economic sanctions. But in real life, in the practical world, I think that the U.S. is making very measured calculations as to what they can really do in the situation and the extent of their commitments to a country that's not an ally, and that's just the fact of it. It's a hard truth, but to people who support obviously Ukraine, but with Ukraine not being a member of the NATO alliance, then the U.S. we saw the U.S. take that position, saying we would not deploy troops to Ukraine, and I think that's part of what we're seeing, the signs of the U.S. realizing the extent to which it's really going to get involved. At the same time, that essentially puts Russia in a tough position because if it does take some sort of action, then it could trigger those economic sanctions, and of course that would inflict pain upon Russia as well. So Russia is also in a precarious position.
Right. When you talked about the different options that Russia has on the table and the kind of action that it may or may not take, of course, there's many. We see that the Russian side keeps on denying its intention to invade, but perhaps that is also an option that could be on the table, Leonid, with reference to any possibility of military action. Is there one or is there not? And secondly, when we see that if the larger goal, as Tom was saying, is to get security assurances from NATO, ideally that is the goal, then what cost is Russia, what length is Russia willing to go to until it gets that? Because right now it seems the situation may be going elsewhere than what has been planned or intended by Russia in the first place.
Let's be realistic. Russia not interested to occupy Ukraine for many reasons, because economic damage and maybe some collateral damage during the a large-scale military conflict on Ukrainian territory, because some Western countries may be involved. I think that real conflict possible only if Ukrainian forces will do some provocation in Donbass. For example, will start ethnic cleanings, and Russia could do a response like it was in 2008 in Georgia, just to stop genocide. It's in frame of Western doctrine of responsibility to protect, for example. And
Right.
I think from Western point of view, it's normal. But
Right.
Russia not interested in doing any
Right.
intrusion
Right.
into
Leonid,
Ukraine and to start bombing Kiev, for example.
Right.
Only
I'm very
this
glad
case
that
is
you
possible.
actually earlier brought up Minsk agreement as well, because right now, recently, the meeting between Macron and Putin actually ended on this note as well. When President Macron has returned, he has actually re-emphasized the need to adhere to Minsk agreement. Do you think that there is still a possibility of that panning out in a positive way, or we are still going to see some kind of conflict and rising temper? Leonid.
The problem is that conflict still going on. If we see the line at some kind of, we can to compare with Kashmir crisis, for example. Every day there is some fire, mostly from Ukrainian side, to the Donbass, and we see the 1% killed or 2% killed. It's still a problem. And Minsk agreement based on diplomatic relations. There should be a diplomatic resolution for this crisis, but it not happened. So Russia tried to push Ukraine during this frame, and Russia is not side of the conflict. It's very clear. Moscow asked to sit Ukrainian side, Kiev and Donbass side, and to sit and discuss what to do next.
So, Tom, I just wanted to ask you, if we talk about the consensus from different countries, the Western countries, what to do against Russia if there is an invasion. As you know, President Putin, he has highlighted as well that the Article 5, they won't have enough time to think about what to do. So, and looking at the current situation, of course, Germans, they have a different position, and the way France is looking at, it's a different one. If we look at the Britain, of course, Prime Minister Johnson, he came up with the idea that they would be putting the sanctions on oligarchs. And if we look at Americans, they have entirely a different position. Don't you think that the consensus would not be mended and consensus would not be reached by all of these countries in case of something happens?
And let me add to this, because I've just seen a statement coming from Chancellor Scholz of Germany, warning President Putin and also Russia. Let me very quickly ask, do you think that this meeting between this Biden-Scholz meeting might have actually hardened Germany's position as well?
Yeah.
Well, I think Germany, and we've talked about this on the show before, I think Germany is in a tough position in a sense because Germany had wanted to pursue a more independent foreign policy track. When it comes to China and Russia and other issues, Germany has a lot of soft power, independent of NATO and other European countries and allies. It also has a massive economy that shores up that soft power. But at the same time, there's only so much Germany can do without actually breaking off from an alliance, because there are obligations to that alliance, of course. And so I think Germany has done a lot to sort of try to distance itself from the more aggressive measures that the other allies are looking to push, not including sanctions, but including military assistance, for example. And even Nord Stream until recently wasn't really discussed and still isn't discussed that much from the German side. But I do think that Germany could potentially be, that position could be hardened if the U.S. applies enough pressure. That being said, the consensus, as you mentioned, is a difficult one. Europe has had divisions since the beginning of civilization. It's been issues forever. Now, there's been a smoothing of these frictions for some time with the Cold War. Western Europe specifically has had come together to form this alliance. It doesn't mean that there aren't outliers, there aren't issues that still exist to this day among every single member state. At the same time, it seems to be that there are different positions emerging. You're hearing this from heads of state. You heard this from when Macron flew to Moscow, Scholz flew to Washington. And there hasn't really been, there's been a stress of unity. We've heard we're taking united position, but we're not necessarily hearing united statements coming out of these different countries. So I think it is difficult to say that there would be a consensus applied. Now, that being said, the last thing I'll say on this is that if sanctions are applied, what the issue there, the broader strategic issue that the U.S. sees specifically, is that would only push Russia further into the Sinosphere as far as economic integration, because it would essentially force Russia to rely even more on the Chinese economy.
Leonid, consensus or no consensus, does it matter to Russia?
I think consensus possible only through very hard negotiation process. But now we see so much disinformation about Russia, about pro-Russian separatists and so on. So it seems very, very difficult to start. And even European politicians, they not see the facts, real facts, what happens. They looking from kind of very own fantasies about Ukrainian crisis, about Donbass, about Russia itself, and about Russian intentions. So main target is Russia from Western point of view, mostly organized by United States and from Euro-Atlantic community. Ukraine is just a good place to enlarge NATO, to enlarge European Union market, etc. But main target is Russia for them.
May I also chip in just for a second,
absolutely.
just to answer what Faisal was asking? I think, of course, consensus matters to everybody because a Western power, when it is united, is really, really huge, right? But here's the problem. The Putin administration's gift to divide West is very significant one. Remember that even right now when we are talking about the US, no other country, even there, the other party, which is not in power, actually is led by Trump, and Trump seems to be in love with Putin, right? His repeated statements and his supporters also keeps on reminding you that they are not going to support a war. So I think that in coming days, that might also, consensus might be difficult, but if it is achieved, then it is going to be a humongous either a deterrence or then a huge war.
Right. Tom, with reference to what can be the possible scenarios that are going to unfold with the Ukrainian crisis, we, of course, can, know that we can possibly expect any sort of move from Vladimir Putin as well, which could surprise us. But with the way that the standoff is continuing, and the longer it continues and the harder the stances the countries take, it becomes increasingly difficult to step back and save face. With the way that diplomatic efforts are going forward, do you see any possibility of a diplomatic solution? And if yes, then what sort of areas would Russia be willing to compromise on or be able to negotiate in terms of its demands if it really does back out of the situation?
So I would first say that the diplomatic track right now has not shown substantial signs of progress. Now, that doesn't mean a death sentence necessarily, of course. You know, in these sort of negotiations, discussions, both sides will naturally present the most maximalist demands and refusals to those demands. It's kind of part of the theater. At the same time, though, if there is no room for compromise and the track for diplomacy certainly narrows over time, then we start to get into some serious escalatory areas, which, of course, the possibilities are endless as to what could occur, from limited clashes to a more global scenario, which, of course, everyone wants to avoid in this situation. Now, as to where areas of compromise are present, I think that the U.S. could potentially reinstate certain missile defense treaties, like we remember the INF that was abandoned by the Trump administration in 2019. And even before that, back in 2002, the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, was abandoned by, I believe it was the Bush administration at the time. This degradation and erosion of the arms control architecture that was built during the Cold War has had a profound effect on Russia's mentality. And we've heard President Putin say many times that this is a problem, and he has at least he said that he felt ignored by it over time, and that's part of the reason Russia has pursued its own military buildup. So I think that certainly arms control measures, if possible, could evoke some sort of goodwill among parties. I also think limiting of military movements and more communication channels when NATO conducts exercises as well. And of course, the big question is Ukraine and its admission to NATO. The irony of this is that there hasn't seemed to be any movement whatsoever from the U.S. or NATO either as to admitting Ukraine. It seems to be quite a far-fetched concept, actually, based on the actual evidence that anything's going to happen for it. At the same time, the U.S. is arguing about principle here, the principle of admitting Ukraine, and so it's quite a high-stakes gamble to be discussing principles at this point. At the same time, of course, the U.S. feels that if they concede on that point, it could lead to other concessions or lead to emboldening Russia. So that's really where the U.S. comes
We have
from.
only time for one more question.
Yeah,
Yes,
Leonid, looking at the current situation, I have a question for Indo-Pacific once again from you. This meetup, of course, it brought you a 30-year contract, a gas pipeline contract with China, plus your existing bilateral trade. It was sitting at $117.6 billion. Now it will be increased to $200 billion. So I just wanted to ask, could we see in coming future this being a hindrance for India to procure their arms from Russia? Because them arms, of course, they will be used against China.
Russia mostly providing arms that are used for defense or for our defense system, for example, and there is some arms for some tanks and rifles and etc. that have universal principle. But I think not that Russia will provoke India to attack China, for example, and Pakistan, because Russia is very careful what provided from problem. And what I know from the last discussion between Russian and Indian sides about military trade and cooperation, India would like to open some segments of our market and military production centers to invite Russia for investment, etc. It's not exactly.
But China would be having concerns related to it.
Sorry?
China would be, of course, having concerns related to these procurements.
Yes,
like S-400.
But
both of them
probably,
have it,
but.
Right. Leonid, very quickly, because we have a dearth of time. Let me very quickly ask you. You must be following President Putin's, decisions and policies. Very quickly, what matters to him more, political image or economic interest of the country?
True. Right.
Geopolitical, I think, both. And politics matters and economics matters.
Thank you very much, Leonid Seven and Tom O'Connor, for being with us on the debate and taking the time out to be part of the discussion. There's, of course, so much that is going on in the world, but we can only understand it if we look at all the different perspectives and try to see the different angles and factors that, of course, are coming into play as well. With regards to what happens in the Ukrainian crisis and Russia's steps in this regard, we can only hope and see that it happens in a positive light and for peace for the people in the world, and hopefully sooner rather than later. But what really is going to happen, no one can know for sure, and it remains to be seen, and we'll be discussing that in the debate. Have a nice weekend. We'll see you once again on Monday at 9 p.m. with more stories from around the world.